So, you're nearly ready to build your models, but what about bases? Nick speaking, and welcome to this video. Right, another back to basics video for you, and in this one I want to cover bases. Now, bases and basing is a very important part of the hobby and for your army, so I hope you find it useful. As always, this video is aimed for beginners. Okay, let's have a look at bases. Okay, so let's talk bases. Now, bases have changed dramatically over the years. Generally the size of the bases and also the shape of the bases, I just want to have a chat about them really, a run through, and then also looking from the point of view of actually like the final result of your model stroke your army. So the Space Marines that I purchased, they were supplied with these bases, and that's because it's an old kit, because if you buy Space Marines nowadays you get these bases, and as you can see there's quite a big difference. So these are 25mm bases and these are 32mm bases. So how do you decide what base size to use? Well, the rule of thumb as stipulated by Games Workshop is that you need to use the base size that your models are supplied with, or bigger, so not necessarily smaller. Now, I think that's a very good rule. I think there is a small exception to that, and that would be if you've already got all of your army based on these small ones, and let's say you buy a brand new unit, so you want to buy a Devastator squad or something, and you buy them and they're on these bases here, I think it's quite reasonable and acceptable for you to change these bases for a smaller base so that it matches your army, because I think that's the look of your army matching in is probably more important than the Games Workshop rule. So that I would say was the exception, but on the whole I think it's a good rule of thumb just to stick with. Use the base size that your models come with, go bigger if you want to make them more dramatic, etc., but don't go smaller. So these are the standard sort of bases, the traditional bases. Now, Games Workshop have recently released some hero bases, and also some base like pre-cut bases, let's say, in different themes, and they're all very good and very cool. Obviously they're more expensive. The bases that are supplied with are very adequate, and there's a lot that you can do with them, which we're going to talk about in a minute. Just want to have a quick chat about the other type of bases which sometimes you will see. So sometimes you'll see these bases and they have like a slot in the middle, and these are called slotter bases. These bases are usually supplied with plastic models that have a very delicate fitting to the base, usually with one leg. So for example, I have this witch here which is just standing on one leg, and that's a slotter base, and basically this leg is on a piece of plastic which slots into that gap. You also see some of the old metal models which use this slotter base as well. So that's what a slotter base is. You also have these type of bases. These are called flying bases. So these are basically clear plastic bases, and the idea is that your model is supposed to be in the air flying. So you generally don't paint this. This section on the bottom, it's a personal choice. Some people like to leave it clear so that whatever table you're on, you can see that underneath. Personally, I like to actually base my bases with some material to match the rest of my army. Now, yes, when you're on a different type of table, it doesn't look quite as good, but at least your base is matching with the whole of your army anyway. So I prefer to base mine, and let me give you an example of that. So I've got a large flying base. This is basically the same, but a bigger flying base. And as you can see, I've based that with my Aldar basing material, but I still have the clear plastic stand so that the models look like they are flying. Now, if you're just wondering what this model is, this is the Autarch that 33 Clay Dog painted up for me. Such an amazing paint job that any chance that I get to get it out of the case, I will do so. Hence, you are looking at it today. And that goes back to base sizes, because talking about jet bikes, in particular, well, they've actually had a bit of a change around on base sizes. So when they first came out, they were on these tiny bases, and then they went up to these, which is when I bought my army. So all of my jet bikes have these, and I believe now they've gone back down to these smaller bikes on the newer ones. So even Games Workshop can't make up their mind. And like I said before, if you use the bases that they come with, or match the bases to the rest of your army, then I don't think you can go wrong, really. Okay, so let's put these aside. Just another example of a flying base which I've painted. So this is my Battlefleet Gothic ship. I think this is called the Void Stalker, I think it's called. But anyway, this is magnetised, of course, as all of my stuff is. And yeah, I've painted up the base, so no basing materials. I've literally just painted on the little galaxy thing so that it matches the theme of the army quite nicely. So that is that one. Okay, so other bases. Well, we have these. These are resin bases. It's almost like the Games Workshop set that I was talking about earlier that they've released, although I believe theirs is plastic. These are basically cast from resin. And there's various companies and stuff that actually do these. If you go to Chief Live Gaming's website, which I'll put a link in the description below, he's got some awesome resin bases on there, so go and check those out. And the reason why you would go for these is because they're a lot more scenic, basically. I mean, if you compare that base, which is a 32mm base, to that one, a lot more scenic. And of course you have the opportunity to put stuff on the top of there and make it more scenic, but then you can just be lazy and buy yourself some already built ones. Now the thing to bear in mind with resin is you have to give it a very thorough wash in warm soapy water. Soak it 2 or 3 days, the longer the better, and then go over it with a toothbrush, get all of the resin out, because if you don't do that, after you've painted, what happens is the resin sometimes seeps through and it can ruin all of your paintwork. So just a little side note really there on resin bases. Okay, so we've got other type of bases. These are the Terminator bases. Well, I call them Terminator bases. I think the Terminator base is actually now even bigger than it was before. As I said, things are changing with Games Workshop. Even, you may have seen these before, square bases. So the square bases traditionally was on the fantasy armies. But now we've got rid of fantasy and we have Age of Sigmar, and Age of Sigmar are actually now changing to round bases. But if you ever come across a square base, then yeah, they're probably from fantasy models. Okay, so that's bases. Now I want to talk about the sort of painting of the bases as such. So ideally, when you're building your army, not only do you want to come up with a paint scheme for your army, you want to try to come up with how you're going to do your bases, because it is actually a very important part of model making. Now, I have an army, my Tyranid army, which I'm going to show you now actually. So this is my Tyranids. So I have Old One Eye, and funny enough, this is the new Carnifex base there, as you see it's even not even round. And then this is the old Carnifex base. So, bit of a difference there. So, as I said, Games Workshop are definitely changing over how they do the bases. But the point I'm making with my Tyranids is that the basing of this army is, I would say, about 50% worth of making it look good. Because when I paint this up here, this model, with just the black base, it looks very boring and plain. As soon as I do the base, it makes that model pop. And the bases are just so important for doing that. Now, the rule generally would be, I mean, we'll probably talk about this more when we're painting our Space Marine, which we're going to paint. But generally the rule would be is that you need a colour which is in either direct contrast of your model. So, for example, where's it gone? There we go. On my Dark Eldar, I'm going to have to admit, when I painted my Dark Eldar in this orange and browny colour, I never envisaged having a green base. But the green base, after lots of experimenting, the green base was the best one for it. It was a nice contrasted colour. Not only do you need a bit of contrast, but it's always a good idea to try and pick out a colour which you've already got on your palette. So in this instance, she's got green hair, which is how I did my Dark Eldar. And that gives me a nice contrast from the browns and orange, but also ties in the base with the model as well. So that's what you've got to sort of look for. Again, with these, I've gone for this sort of almost yellowy, browny colour, which just matches in with the actual paint scheme of the actual model. So finding your colours, of course my Eldar one again is just green grass with some brown rocks, and sometimes you just have to pick a theme. You know, whether it actually matches your army or not, maybe it matches your table. Regardless, it doesn't really matter how you come to the decision of how to do your bases, whether it be lava bases or grass, or or a Mars planet. Maybe you're just going to get some of the textured paint that Games Workshop sell, or make your own textured paint and maybe just blob that on there. It doesn't matter. The key thing is that you do it. Because models that are not based are models that aren't finished. The basing is very, very important to finishing up your army, and try your absolute best to get all of the units to have the same bases, because it really brings your army together. It's very, very important. And in addition to that, it's the rim of the bases as well. So what I mean by that is these rims here. Now, of course, it is all personal preference, but personally I like to have my rims here very, very clean and totally have none of the basing material on it. Now, some people like to have the sand sort of coming down over the edge of the base. That's fine if you like that. Personally, I don't. I like to have this edge really, really clean going around there. But you also need to pick the colour of this edge to match, again, your army. So for example, on this one I've got black, and then on my Eldar, although you can't really see it that well because it's quite a thin base, but I've got brown. Now I am quite fussy, I even paint underneath the bases, but again that's just me. But look how that finishes it off. Now if I just left that clear, with that clear edge, it just wouldn't look as good. So it's very, very important to get some good basing. Now some of your models, certainly your character models, it may be a good idea to do some almost themed bases. So almost like a centerpiece. Now let me just bring this guy in. Now I've only got the bottom half because he is magnetized anyway. But this is my Wraith Knight, and I have a whole scene on the bottom here. I have this destroyed land speeder. What's happened is the Wraith Knight has shot this guy with a scatter laser. He's blown him up, as you can see. There's blood, there's a head on the back of the canopy, and they've crashed on the ground. The Wraith Knight has come up and he's just stomped on the speeder. He's broken in half with his big heavy foot going through. And then this guy here, he's cowering. Look, he's got his hand up over his head. He just can't bear to look to see what this Wraith Knight is going to do to him. So I've got a little story going on there, and that really helps you build a little theme up to get a nice, really nice looking base. And I'm not saying doing it for your whole army, but one or two models, especially if you have a nice big base, and it's a great opportunity to add another dimension, make your army looking really, really interesting, and have a centerpiece, whether it's just one HQ or your flyer or something. Just add some extra detail to that base. It makes a huge, huge difference. Okay, so there was one last thing that I wanted to talk about actually, and that is going right back to the very first video that we had where we talked about cutting off the sprue, and then the second video where we talked about removing mould lines. So it's really nice to see that Games Workshop now are actually putting the join of the sprue, although they don't actually come on a sprue, but the join of the actual moulding just on the top here. Now in the old days they used to put them on the side, and then when you cut them off you used to end up with like a little bloppy thing on there. So if you do have bases like that, don't forget to clean that off as well. make this little rim here nice and smooth. You don't want to see a big blob of plastic just on the side, or a big indentation where you've just pulled it off. So be really careful with that as well, taking it off the sprue. Make sure your bases are all nicely cleaned up, to the point that I even go in with my knife and I actually just take off this here, because what happens, this edge at the bottom here, sometimes you get little bits of plastic just coming off, so I like to clean up the edges of my bases as well. So yeah, very, very important bases. You could almost say that the base is probably the most vital part of your models. If you've got some good bases and nice bases and cool bases, it can really, really add to your army. Okay, so that's it for this video. Thanks very much for watching as always, and I'll see you in the next one.